What if two children could see the sins you thought were buried forever? What if they spoke aloud the secrets you never confessed, and the names of the dead you believed time had erased? Tonight we open the record of Pine Hollow, Kentucky, 1834, a town that prayed on Sunday and hid bones beneath its church floor. For 3 days, it was visited by a traveling preacher and his 9-year-old twin daughters. They arrived with nothing but weary steps and a Bible in a satchel. Yet within hours, they began to speak, quietly, calmly, of things no stranger could ever know. They revealed bottles hidden under floorboards, letters locked away in drawers, children concealed in attics. They described a family, long thought lost to fire, naming their garments, their trinkets, their cries. They spoke of murders committed years before their own birth, describing with impossible precision where the bodies lay and what relics they still carried in the soil. And when the earth was broken open, their words were confirmed. This is not folklore. The Kentucky State Archives still hold Judge Harrison's 47-page report, and the journals of Pastor William Phillips remain preserved by his descendants. They testify not to imagination, but to something the law itself could not explain. Before we begin, welcome to Gothic Ledger. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time of night or day is it there? And if you find yourself drawn into the shadows of these forgotten histories, remember to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next case that should have been forgotten but was not. Now, let us return to Pine Hollow and the 3 days when 2 children forced an entire town to face the voices it had silenced. In the late autumn of 1834, the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison reached the settlement of Pine Hollow, a place so small and so removed from the wider world that most maps neglected to name it. The community had been founded in 1818 by 3 families seeking separation from denominational conflict, their doctrines reduced to a strict and narrow form of Baptist order. By the time Morrison arrived, scarcely 200 souls remained, most linked by ties of marriage or descent, each life measured by the rhythm of Sunday sermons and the weight of Scripture enforced as law. Pine Hollow was a village of survival rather than comfort. Its church stood at the center, a wooden structure built from the surrounding timber, erected at great cost in labor but little in ornament. Around it clustered cabins of notched logs, smoke rising from their stone chimneys into the early winter air. The foothills of the Cumberland closed in upon the place, trapping morning mist in the valleys and ensuring that Pine Hollow felt less a town than a pocket of endurance, carved reluctantly into wilderness. Into this enclosed community walked a widower and his children. Ezekiel Morrison was no stranger to such roads. At 34 years, his hair already silvered, his boots worn through, his face lined with hardship. He carried with him a satchel containing a Bible and little else. For 9 years he had walked the mountain circuits, preaching to outlying congregations that lacked regular ministers, a man of faith and endurance, whose arrival was more often seen as duty fulfilled than miracle performed. His wife Sarah had died in childbirth, an event that gave him his twin daughters and left him bound to a grief he never publicly named. The children themselves drew eyes more than the father. Rebecca and Rachel, aged 9, identical in appearance yet distinct in bearing. Rebecca walked ahead, her step confident, her smile faintly visible even through the fatigue of travel. Rachel moved closer to her father, paler, reserved, her eyes sharp with a watchfulness uncommon in the young. Those who observed carefully noticed that the sisters moved almost as one, that pauses in one's speech were completed by the other, that gestures seemed mirrored without thought. When Pastor William Phillips first recorded their arrival in his meticulous ledger, he described them in terms of weariness beyond their years, Their clothing was patched from use, their faces drawn by fever and travel. Yet it was not poverty that unsettled him. It was the unnatural alertness in their gaze, an awareness that seemed to extend beyond observation, as though their attention pressed deeper than appearances allowed. Phillips, a man of order and documentation, was not given to impressions. Still, his journal reflects unease at their first meeting. He noted that their entry into Pine Hollow was accompanied by silence among the townsfolk who had gathered to see them. Suspicion had always been a feature of small, isolated communities, where strangers threatened fragile cohesion. Yet the reaction to the Morrisons contained something heavier than ordinary mistrust. It was not only the outsider they studied with caution, it was the children whose presence seemed to unsettle before a word had been spoken. Thus began their 3 days in Pine Hollow, an arrival unremarkable in fact, but unforgettable in atmosphere. A weary preacher, 2 alert and silent children, and a community whose suspicion would soon deepen into dread. The morning after their arrival, the settlement of Pine Hollow stirred under a brittle wind. Pastor William Phillips rose, as was his habit before dawn, his routine anchored by prayer, scripture, and the quiet preparation of the day's sermon. Yet on this particular morning, the usual order was unsettled. The Morrison family had been given lodging in a spare cabin near the church, and when Phillips entered to offer greeting, he found Ezekiel already awake, seated beside the fading embers of a fire. The preacher's Bible lay open on his lap, but his eyes were distant, shadowed by concern. It was here, Phillips later wrote in his journal, that he first noticed the burden the father carried. Ezekiel spoke in a low voice, confessing that his daughters had endured disturbing dreams through the night. Dreams, he said, that often preceded their arrival in new places. At first he had dismissed them as childish intuition, but with time the visions had become specific, undeniable. This time, however, he said the dreams were darker. Phillips was not given the chance to answer before one of the twins appeared. Rebecca, hair dishevelled, her small face marked by travel weariness, spoke with a composure that startled her host. She told him, in the simple cadence of a child, that beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar in his church lay something hidden, something that ought not to be there. She said that her sister had dreamed of it, and she herself had dreamed of why it was hidden. Phillips felt his composure falter. His body stiffened in the cold air, though the fire still glowed. For beneath that exact floorboard he had concealed a bottle, a single object that represented his private shame. It was whiskey, wrapped in a strip of faded blue cloth, the remnant of the blanket that had once belonged to his infant son. That child had died 5 years earlier, an event that had marked his family with silence. In weakness, the pastor had kept the bottle close, hidden where no eyes might find it, telling himself that temptation was more easily resisted if it could be confronted daily. Not a soul knew of this secret, yet the child standing in his doorway spoke of it with certainty. Rebecca's words were soon joined by Rachel's quiet confirmation. She described the bottle as brown glass, bound in a cloth the color of a sky fading to dusk. She said the cloth was not ordinary fabric, but part of a blanket meant for a baby who had not lived to use it. Her tone was flat, unadorned, neither cruel nor sympathetic, yet the weight of detail left Phillips without strength. He sank into a chair, unable to deny what only God and his conscience should have known. Ezekiel, watching with a weary familiarity, spoke softly. It had begun when the girls were still very young, he explained. At first he thought it was instinct, a sensitivity to things adults overlooked. But as years passed, the details sharpened, the knowledge grew impossible. He no longer named it blessing or curse, only a burden they carried, for reasons he could not understand. For Pastor Phillips, the moment was decisive. The twins had reached into a place of secrecy he had guarded with shame, pulling into daylight a sin he believed forever hidden. And though they spoke with innocence, what they revealed struck with the force of judgment. Sunday service in Pine Hollow had begun without incident. Reverend Morrison preached a sermon of renewal, the familiar cadence of Scripture rising from a voice worn by the road. The words themselves were nothing extraordinary, though delivered with sincerity. A call to confession, a reminder that no sin was too great for mercy. When the service concluded, the congregation filed out in orderly fashion, their faces reflecting the ritual calm of duty performed. It was in this departure, in the moment of ordinary dismissal, that the unraveling began. Rebecca moved first. She stepped from her father's side and walked to Samuel Turner, a farmer known for his steady tithes and prominent standing among the congregation. Looking up with clear eyes, she remarked with innocent tone that the money Turner had been taking from the collection was not truly theft if it was meant to be returned. The words were spoken without malice, but they struck with precision. Turner's composure collapsed instantly. His face drained of color, his hands trembled. For 6 months he had skimmed the plate in secret, covering debts born of a failed venture in Louisville. He had told himself it was a loan, but the shame had hollowed him from within. Not even his wife knew, yet the child had spoken it plainly before all. Before Turner could recover, Rachel turned her gaze to Martha Whitfield, the widow whose authority in matters of morality had shaped Pine Hollow for 2 decades. Rachel's voice, soft but distinct, carried across the silence. She told Mrs. Whitfield that her husband had not perished in a farming accident, as the village believed, but was still alive, writing her letters from Missouri. The widow faltered, her knees weakening beneath the revelation. For 15 years she had concealed the truth, that her husband had abandoned her and their children. To preserve dignity, she had rewritten his story, burying the shame beneath the fiction of death. The letters, hidden carefully, had remained untouched by other eyes, and now, without warning, a child exposed what no one else had ever known. The congregation froze, yet the twins moved with calm inevitability, crossing the room as if guided. To the Miller family, they spoke of a son locked away in the attic, a young man whose simple mind had been hidden from neighbors in shame. To young Thomas Brett, they described his meetings with Elizabeth Carter, the married woman who had entertained his attentions while her husband traveled. Each disclosure was made without accusation, spoken as simple fact, as if commenting on weather or harvest. Yet each landed with surgical accuracy, cutting into the marrow of reputation and exposing veins of secrecy. Those who witnessed it described the silence as absolute. No cough, no rustle of movement, only the sound of children's voices recounting things they could not have known. Men who prided themselves on honesty shrank into corners. Women whose dignity rested on concealment found their private histories laid bare. The air thickened with dread, not only of judgment, but of the uncanny knowledge that judged them. Pastor Phillips, standing at the altar, watched as his ordered congregation dissolved into stunned fragments. In his journal he recorded it as the moment when Pine Hollow ceased to be an ordinary church and became instead a chamber of exposure. The twins spoke without malice, yet their innocence only deepened the terror. For here, before all eyes, 2 children unmasked what the community believed safely hidden in silence. It was not yet accusation. It was revelation, delivered by voices too young to be credible, yet too precise to be denied. The revelations of private sin had left Pine Hollow suspended in a silence that felt like suffocation. Yet what followed exceeded confession and entered the realm of history itself, cutting into the foundation of the settlement. Rebecca stood before the altar, her hand resting on the wooden cross carved by the founding families in the earliest years of Pine Hollow. Her voice, though childish, carried with unnatural clarity. She declared that the ground was not holy as the people believed. It had been stained, she said, by what happened there long before. The Whitman family had not died in a house fire as recorded. They had died in the church itself, in the very room where the congregation now stood. The statement struck the assembly like a physical blow. The Whitmans were a name long buried in memory. Jacob, the blacksmith, his wife Mary, their twin daughters, Hope and Faith. The record maintained by Phillips's predecessor had described their end as a winter tragedy. A house fire, bodies retrieved, burial performed with Christian ceremony. For 16 years this account had remained unchallenged, yet the child declared it false. What followed deepened the unease beyond dismissal. Rebecca gave details that Faith bore a small birthmark on her left shoulder, Hope a matching mark at her right ankle, that Faith carried always a wooden doll carved by her father, while Hope wore a silver locket holding strands of her mother's hair. She spoke of their last moments, of Faith dressed in her blue Sunday garment, Hope confined to a nightgown, ill with fever, each element precise, each element impossible for her to know. Rachel, moving beside her sister with the same solemn composure, added further detail. She spoke of the girls hiding behind the altar, seeking sanctuary as their parents had brought them into the church. She spoke of crying heard, then silence. Her words were not dramatic. They were measured, plain, as if simply describing what had once been witnessed. The congregation did not respond with noise, but with the weight of recognition. Faces turned pale, hands tightened upon pews. Those of advanced age shifted uneasily, their eyes downcast. Some had known the Whitman children personally, remembered their songs in the choir, their laughter in the settlement lanes. The descriptions given by the Morrison twins could not be dismissed as invention. They matched memory too closely. One man, Elder Thompson, 73 years old and among the first to settle the valley, rose slowly, his voice unsteady. He asked how children born years later, strangers to the place, could describe what was never recorded, never spoken. To this, Rebecca answered only with the details of the sisters' belongings and their condition in death, details that matched objects remembered by those present at the original burial, yet never included in any official record. The room grew claustrophobic. Even the wind beyond the walls seemed to halt. Whispers of unease passed through the assembly, fragments of memory resurfacing, bloodstains that would not wash from floorboards, sounds at night mistaken for wind. Pastor Phillips, whose careful order had preserved the community's stories, felt the ledger of history itself begin to split. Thus, in a single moment, a narrative 16 years old collapsed. The Whitman family had not perished in accident but in violence, and the church itself was revealed as the scene of their death. That evening, after the congregation dispersed in uneasy fragments, Pastor William Phillips found himself unable to resume the steady course of his nightly prayers. The revelations spoken by the Morrison twins clung to him with the persistence of smoke, seeping into his mind until the words of Scripture could no longer quiet them. It was not only the impossibility of their knowledge that disturbed him, but the way their words aligned with the subtle absences he had long observed in the records of Pine Hollow. Since his arrival 5 years earlier, Phillips had studied the ledgers left behind by his predecessor, Pastor Morai Hayes. These documents recorded with meticulous care each birth, marriage, and death. Yet even within that rigor, there had been a gap. The winter of 1818, where the record should have spoken clearly of the Whitman family, there was only brevity, a single entry summarizing their supposed destruction by fire. It had always struck Phillips as uncharacteristic. Hayes was not a man of omissions. Driven by a mixture of dread and duty, Phillips returned to the church alone. The sanctuary lay in shadow, the faint glow of his candle throwing long shapes across the pews. It was there near the stone foundation that his search began. He traced the wall where he had once felt a subtle draught, a place where the stonework seemed uneven. Beneath the mortar, behind a loose stone set apart from the rest, he discovered what the twins had already named without ever seeing. A journal wrapped in leather, its pages water-stained and fragile with age. By the wavering light of the candle, Phillips read. The entries began with routine matters, accounts of harsh weather, shortages of food and deaths of elderly settlers during the first years of Pine Hollow. Yet as he turned the pages, the tone altered. Hayes's handwriting, steady at first, grew erratic, his words edged with unease. He wrote of Jacob Whitman confronting certain leaders of the community, demanding confession and reparation for matters unfit for silence. The specifics were vague, but Hayes's tone conveyed fear. He spoke of voices raised in anger, accusations of theft and dishonor, and threats that exposure would bring ruin upon the fragile settlement. The final entry, dated December 22nd, 1818, was unlike the rest. Its words were unsteady, the ink darker, as if pressed by a trembling hand. The Lord forgive us all for what was done. Jacob and his family came seeking sanctuary, but they were followed. I heard the children crying, then silence. When morning came, we found them as they had been left. Elder Thompson and the others insisted the truth must be buried, that the community's survival demanded it. I have agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul. Phillips lowered the book with hands that shook as though chilled by unseen wind. Here, in the words of his predecessor, lay confirmation of what the Morrison twins had declared. The Whitman family had not died by fire, but by violence, concealed within the very walls of the church itself. The discovery did not bring clarity. It brought only the confirmation that Pine Hollow's foundation rested on deceit and blood, preserved in silence for 16 years. And now, through a hidden journal and the voices of 2 children, the silence had been broken. When the revelations of Pastor Hayes's hidden journal reached the congregation, disbelief gave way to dread. The accusations spoken by the Morrison twins had been confirmed in writing, yet the question remained, how could such knowledge pass to children not yet born at the time of the events? It was in the stillness that followed these discoveries that the twins themselves provided explanation, not in the manner of scholars or theologians, but with the simple weariness of those burdened too early. Rebecca spoke first. Her voice, though young, carried none of childhood's lightness. She told those gathered that they did not choose what they saw. The dreams came unbidden, whether welcomed or feared. At times they brought fragments of the future, at others, echoes of the past. We see what was, what is, and sometimes what will be, she said, her words recorded later by Phillips with the precision of testimony. Rachel stood beside her, silent at first, then added that the sisters Faith and Hope Whitman visited them often. They came not as shadows, but as children, singing, crying, pleading to be remembered. The girls described visions of small hands clutching at wooden pews, of a doll abandoned in haste, of voices crying out for safety where none was given. To them, these images were not stories but lived experience, folded into their dreams with relentless clarity. The congregation listened in silence that deepened into something close to fear. The image of innocence channeling innocence unsettled them more than judgment itself. The Morrison twins did not accuse. They remembered. They repeated what was shown to them, bearing the weight of memory that belonged to others. Pastor Phillips, in his journal, noted that their faces seemed aged beyond their years in these moments. Rebecca's expression, once bright, had dulled into solemnity, her eyes carrying a depth unsuited to 9 years of life. Rachel's silence, so often mistaken for shyness, appeared now as endurance, the quiet patience of one who bore what others could not see. Their father, Ezekiel, offered little beyond a weary acknowledgement. He explained that such visions had begun when the girls were very small, at first dismissed as coincidence, then recognized as something far beyond. He had once believed their gift divine, a blessing meant to guide communities toward truth. But time and repetition had convinced him otherwise. Their burden, he said, consumed them. They carried not only their own lives, but the grief and corruption of others, voices that demanded to be heard regardless of their innocence. The congregation's response was not uniform. Some regarded the children with reverence, as if prophets sent to reveal what the living had concealed. Others recoiled in suspicion, seeing not divine gift, but unnatural intrusion. Yet none could deny the precision of their knowledge, nor the cost upon their small frames. Thus the twins stood, weary and solemn, bearing the unbearable. They were children in form, yet vessels for histories the earth itself had refused to keep buried. And though their voices trembled with fatigue, what they revealed would not allow silence. On the third morning of the Morrisons' stay, Pine Hollow received a visitor unlike those accustomed to its hidden valley. A single rider approached from the eastern trail, his clothing formal, his posture dignified, his manner bearing the weight of authority. He gave his name as Thomas Brennan, solicitor of Lexington, and announced his purpose, to trace the unsettled estate of Marcus Webb, a man whose disappearance along these trails in 1819 had left questions unresolved in both law and family. Brennan explained his presence with the clarity of legal duty. Among Webb's effects had been letters describing intended purchases of land in Tennessee. Funds, he said, had been withdrawn but never delivered. Inquiries into Webb's passage revealed that his route had crossed through the Cumberland foothills at precisely the time Pine Hollow was being established. Brennan had come to determine whether the missing money had reached this settlement, and if so, how. The congregation listened with unease. The timing of Brennan's questions struck too near the accusations already spoken by the Morrison twins. Yet the solicitor pursued his duty without awareness of what had transpired in recent days. His inquiry, clinical and methodical, soon intersected with revelations beyond his comprehension. It was Rebecca who spoke first. Standing near the church doorway, she looked upon Brennan with an expression neither curious nor fearful. She told him that Marcus Webb carried a gold watch, engraved with his initials. The crystal was cracked across the face, a flaw made when he dropped it from his horse. The solicitor froze. This detail had appeared only in Webb's private correspondence with his brother, documents never disclosed beyond the family. Brennan demanded how such knowledge could exist in the mind of a child. Rachel, standing beside her sister, spoke softly. She said the watch along, with Webb's money bag and his horse's bridle, lay buried behind the church. The items had been placed there by Elder Thompson after what happened on the trail. Her statement was delivered without emphasis, yet it carried the finality of deposition. At this, murmurs swept through those present. Elder Thompson's face, already lined by years and secrets, grew ashen. Brennan, abandoning formality, insisted upon immediate excavation. He declared that if the children's account proved true, it would constitute evidence of robbery and murder, crimes concealed beneath the very ground of their worship. Several men of the congregation, pressed by Brennan's authority, took up shovels. Pastor Phillips, watching with dread, noted in his record that the air itself seemed heavy as the earth was turned. Barely 3 feet below the surface, metal struck metal. What emerged matched the twins' account precisely. A tarnished gold watch, cracked crystal across its face, initials M.W. engraved within. Beside it lay a decayed leather pouch and remnants of tack. Brennan examined the objects with the precision of legal proof. Each detail corresponded exactly to Webb's estate records. The coincidence of description and discovery admitted no dismissal. Thus Pine Hollow, already shaken by hidden sins and the unearthed journal of its former pastor, now faced intrusion from the outside world. The solicitor's arrival did not merely confirm the children's impossible knowledge. It began the formal process by which that knowledge would be weighed in courts of law. The discovery of Marcus Webb's watch behind the church brought Pine Hollow into a silence deeper than any sermon pause. It was a silence weighted not by reverence but by inevitability, as though the ground itself had delivered testimony. In that stillness, Elder Abraham Thompson, the settlement's oldest surviving founder, began to unravel. Thompson had been present since 1818, one of the 3 men who had cut timber for the church's frame and nailed the first boards into place. For years, his authority had been unquestioned, his words treated as the measure of law. Yet as Brennan held the cracked watch to the light, the elder's composure collapsed. His hands shook visibly. He sat heavily upon a pew as though the weight of 16 years had returned at once. Witnesses described him speaking not with defiance but with exhaustion. He admitted, haltingly at first, that the settlement had been founded not only by labor, but by blood. In the hungry winters of its beginning, travelers passing along the ridge had been marked as opportunity. Alone, often carrying money for land or trade, they became victims when desperation pressed hardest. The elder confessed that Marcus Webb had not been chosen for murder. He was meant only to be robbed. Yet when he resisted, the struggle ended in violence. His death, Thompson said, had haunted his nights thereafter. He spoke of dreams in which Webb's face appeared at the foot of his bed, silent but accusing. He confessed to hearing the sound of hoofbeats in sleep, always stopping at the door, always waiting. Thompson's words were not offered as defense but as record. He listed names remembered from the trail: a surveyor, a merchant, a preacher carrying coins sewn into his saddle. 11 men in total, their money and goods diverted into the building of Pine Hollow. "We told ourselves," Thompson whispered, that God would forgive, for we used it to build his house, but the house has been stained ever since. The congregation listened with expressions that shifted between shock and grim recognition. Some wept, others stared fixedly at the floor. These were not strangers accused of hidden crimes. These were the fathers of families, the founders of homes, men whose reputations had served as cornerstones of communal faith. Yet the elder's voice carried the unmistakable cadence of truth, heavy with age and free of denial. Pastor Phillips recorded the moment clinically in his ledger, noting that the confession confirmed the substance of the twins' revelations. He remarked also on the peculiarity of the elder's resignation, that Thompson spoke less as a man defending himself than as one relieved at last of concealment. When he finished, the elder sat silent, his shoulders bent, his eyes fixed not upon the congregation, but upon the earthen floor, as though seeing again the ground into which he had ordered bodies placed. The watch lay upon the pulpit before him, its cracked surface glinting in the candlelight like a verdict already delivered. Thus the silence of Pine Hollow ended not with denial but with confession. Elder Thompson, once the community's pillar, became its own witness against itself. Elder Thompson's testimony had already dismantled the carefully constructed narrative of Pine Hollow's past, yet the Morrison twins, standing silent beside the pulpit, were not finished. What came next extended the crime beyond recordable fact into the realm of theological terror. Rebecca spoke first, her voice thin but clear. She told the congregation that the Whitman family had not died as 4. Mary Whitman, she said, had carried 2 children yet unborn near the end of her term. It was not 4 lives lost, but 6, Rebecca explained, her eyes fixed upon the stunned faces before her. 4 souls cry out for justice. The effect was immediate and profound. Gasps rippled through the church, followed by a silence more suffocating than before. The gravity of murder was already unbearable. The murder of the innocent within the womb extended the horror into the metaphysical. The congregation did not face only the deaths of neighbors, but the extinguishing of potential lives never seen. Rachel added to her sister's statement with characteristic calm. She described Mary as heavy with child, her breath strained as she entered the church seeking sanctuary. She said that the unborn girls cried in their dreams still, unable to rest, bound to the violence that had ended them before they could be delivered into life. Her tone was not theatrical but steady, as though she recited from an unseen ledger. At this, Dr. Hayes, who had once assisted with the burials, broke his silence. In measured words, he admitted that evidence of pregnancy had indeed been observed. The detail had been dismissed in haste, explained away as inconsequential, and deliberately omitted from any record. "We told ourselves," he said softly, "that children unborn possessed no soul, and therefore required no rights." The admission sent a shudder through the assembly. The theological framework upon which their community rested faltered. If life within the womb bore equal weight before God, then concealment of that truth was not merely negligence, but desecration. Women in the pews wept quietly. Men bowed their heads. The elder who had confessed moments earlier covered his face in his hands. Pastor Phillips, in his journal, recorded this moment with an uncharacteristic note of dread. He wrote that the congregation did not appear as living witnesses, but as participants in a collective haunting. The revelation expanded guilt beyond measure. The crime was no longer contained to one family, but to a multiplication of the innocent extinguished before their first breath. Ezekiel Morrison stood apart, his expression grave but unsurprised. He had seen this pattern before. His daughters bearing knowledge no one should carry, speaking truths that shifted entire communities into confrontation with their buried sins. He did not call it gift or curse, he called it weight. Thus, the story of the Whitman tragedy deepened. Pine Hollow had believed itself guilty of 4 deaths. The twins revealed it was 6, 2 never named, 2 never buried, 2 whose cries still echoed in the dreams of children not their own. And the congregation, bound by faith and silence, found itself judged not only by history but by eternity. By the 4th day, Pine Hollow ceased to belong to itself. A delegation arrived from the county seat. Sheriff Mackenzie, 2 marshals, and Judge Elias Harrison, a man known for his severity and unbending regard for procedure. The choice of venue for the hearing was deliberate. Harrison convened his court inside the church itself, declaring that the site of accusation would also serve as the place of testimony. The sanctuary, consecrated 16 years earlier, now became a tribunal. The congregation filled the pews not as worshippers, but as witnesses. Elder Thompson sat in chains, his face hollow, the burden of confession still pressing visibly upon him. Before the pulpit stood the Morrison twins, impossibly small figures summoned not for worship, but for examination. Proceedings began with formal record. Judge Harrison read aloud the discovery of Marcus Webb's watch and money bag, the corroborating confession of Thompson, and the fragments of Hayes's journal retrieved from the church foundation. Each item was entered into testimony, the tone judicial, the cadence precise. Attention then turned to the children. The judge addressed Rebecca first. His questions were framed as inquisition, meant to test reliability. "How," he asked, "did you know the location of Marcus Webb's personal effects?" Rebecca answered without hesitation, "Faith Whitman told me in a dream. She said the same men who killed her family also killed the travelers. She wanted it known." The judge pressed further, asking Rachel how she could describe details that occurred years before her birth. Rachel replied that the dreams came without invitation. "We see what happened as if present. We hear the last words. We feel the fear they felt." Sheriff Mackenzie, skeptical of children's testimony, shifted the inquiry toward quantifiable detail. How many victims? What names? What circumstances? The twins responded in measured cadence, alternately completing one another's phrases. They listed 11 men over 3 years, a surveyor named Patterson, a preacher named Collins, a merchant named Morse, each identified with personal effects or physical details. They described a bay mare with a star-shaped marking belonging to Collins, a silver-handled knife carried by Morse, coins sewn into a saddle, a copper cross hung around a minister's neck. The sheriff consulted his notebook of missing persons. To the astonishment of those assembled, each description aligned precisely with reports filed years earlier. The coincidences exceeded explanation. The congregation sat in silence as testimony accumulated. Some regarded the twins with reverence, others with unease, yet none could deny the accuracy of their knowledge. Elder Thompson, when pressed again, confirmed the truth of their words. His voice broke as he acknowledged that these names belonged to men buried in secret graves, their possessions seized to sustain Pine Hollow's survival. Judge Harrison recorded each detail formally, his notes methodical, his face betraying no outward reaction. Yet his closing statement, entered into the official record, carried weight beyond procedure. This court acknowledges the testimony of Rebecca and Rachel Morrison as both precise and corroborated. Though its origin remains without natural explanation, its accuracy compels legal consideration. Thus the church that had been built with blood was transformed into a court of law. Beneath its beams and before its cross, justice, earthly and eternal, was set into motion. Under Judge Harrison's order, the sanctuary of Pine Hollow ceased to function as a house of prayer and was reduced to a site of excavation. The wooden planks nearest the pulpit were pried loose by the sheriff's men, their tools striking against earth compacted by years of footfall and ceremony. What had long been walked upon as sacred ground was now treated as contested evidence. Work progressed slowly, each shovelful of soil removed under the magistrate's strict supervision. The atmosphere, though tense, carried none of the fervor of earlier revelations. It was methodical, almost clinical, as though the building itself had been reclassified as an archaeological trench. The congregation remained seated in silence, compelled by law to witness the dismantling of their own sanctuary. Within hours the first discovery emerged. The shovel of Deputy Carrow struck against metal, followed by the unmistakable resistance of bone. Careful brushing revealed the remains of a human hand curled against the earth. Excavation widened until the full skeleton was revealed. A man interred without ceremony, bones stained by soil, position suggestive not of burial but of concealment. Around the neck lay a copper cross, tarnished but intact. It matched precisely the description preserved in the family records of Reverend Robert Chen, a traveling minister who vanished in 1819 while carrying donation funds to Tennessee. Further digging yielded a second skeleton. With it, a silver-handled knife, the hilt corroded, yet still bearing the merchant's mark of William Morse, missing from regional trade routes since 1818. The knife was recognized at once by one of the elder settlers who had seen Morse carry it on earlier journeys through the valley. A third skeleton lay beneath the eastern beam. This one was identified not by weaponry but by jewelry. A gold ring engraved with the initials J.P. Consis. Tent with the surveyor Joshua Patterson, whose disappearance had been noted in county ledgers. The bone of the hand still encircled the ring finger, as though the object had resisted all attempts at removal. Each discovery was catalogued by Judge Harrison's hand, his notes as precise as any legal transcript. Sheriff Mackenzie confirmed the identifications against missing person reports preserved at the county seat. The evidence left no ambiguity. The floor of the church, for 16 years a platform for sermons, sacraments and marriages, had concealed within its very foundations the remains of men whose absence had haunted regional records. The congregation bore witness in silence, their expressions alternating between disbelief and recognition. What the Morrison twins had described in dream and vision was now corroborated by physical fact. Their impossible testimony aligned exactly with relics drawn from the earth. Pastor Phillips recorded in his journal that the atmosphere within the sanctuary had shifted irreversibly. It no longer resembled a place of worship, but a chamber of exhumation, where bones supplanted scripture as the final authority. The discovery did not invite speculation. It demanded acknowledgement. Thus, beneath the pulpit from which righteousness had been proclaimed, the truth was unearthed. The church itself had stood upon the unmarked graves of the murdered. On the fourth day of proceedings, Judge Elias Harrison issued his ruling. The decision was delivered within the church itself, the same structure whose foundations had yielded both bones and artifacts. His words, transcribed by clerks and later preserved in county records, carried the weight not only of law, but of finality. The evidence, he declared, was overwhelming and irrefutable. 11 men, travelling alone through the Cumberland foothills between 1818 and 1820, had been murdered. Their possessions, identified with precision, had been unearthed beneath the floor and behind the church. The funds derived from these crimes had been applied directly to the establishment of Pine Hollow, its church, its mills, its very survival. This community, Harrison wrote in his final report, has been built with blood money. No sanctity can arise from such a foundation. The ruling was unambiguous. Pine Hollow would be dismantled. The church boards, the millstones, the very timbers of the settlement were to be sold, their proceeds directed toward restitution for the victims' families, as far as records and surviving heirs could be traced. The decision carried legal precedent. Never before had a community itself been dissolved as an act of restitution. The judgment struck with crushing inevitability. Families who had tilled soil, raised children, and buried generations beneath the valley's stones learned that their homes were legally condemned. Property deeds, already fragile under frontier law, were voided. No household stood exempt. Each structure was reclassified not as legacy, but as asset to be liquidated. The reaction within the congregation was subdued, almost vacant. There were no protests recorded, only silent resignation. Years of labour, marriages, births and memories, declared null by the crime that underwrote them. Phillips, in his journal, wrote that the silence of the assembled could be measured not by piety, but by collapse. Restitution itself was limited. Many families of the slain had dispersed or vanished into the expanding frontier. Where heirs could be located, Sheriff Mackenzie and Solicitor Brennan were instructed to distribute the funds proportionally. The Marcus Webb estate, most carefully documented, was prioritized, his surviving kin to receive both monetary compensation and the return of his watch, now reclassified as evidence discharged. For others, compensation could not equal the weight of years spent without resolution. The dismantling of Pine Hollow was scheduled to commence immediately. Residents were ordered to vacate within 30 days. Structures would be auctioned, proceeds transferred under Harrison's oversight. Phillips described the mood in those final assemblies as that of a town already hollow, its people dispersed in spirit before their feet had left the valley. What remained was less judgment upon individuals than condemnation of place. Harrison's ruling closed with the statement, "A community born of concealed murder is not a community but a monument to crime. Pine Hollow must not endure." Thus, in the record of the court, the fate of Pine Hollow was sealed, not with fire or flood, but by decree. Its dissolution was inevitable. its name struck not by nature, but by the slow pen of law. Judge Harrison's ruling might have concluded the matter. Crimes acknowledged, restitution ordered, the community condemned. Yet the Morrison twins, silent through much of the proceedings, were not finished. Their final revelations expanded the scope of guilt beyond the years of Pine Hollow's founding, carrying it into the present with implications more chilling than any court could contain. Rebecca spoke first. She stood at the edge of the pulpit, her voice steady, though childlike. The killings, she said, had not ended in 1820. The methods used in those early years, ambush along the ridge, concealment of bodies in natural hollows, quiet dispersal of possessions, had continued long after the original perpetrators grew old. Others learned, she said, and the trail remained hungry. Rachel, as so often, completed the thought. She described bodies discarded in the mine shaft east of town, their bones buried beneath collapsed timbers. Others, she said, had been thrown into Devil's Creek, where the current ran swift enough to erase surface traces, but not the cries of those taken. 3 more, she whispered, lay beneath the very floor of the church until unearthed by spades only days before. The congregation shuddered, for these words suggested not closure but contagion, a legacy of murder carried forward by those who had inherited the techniques of concealment. Pine Hollow, once imagined as a refuge carved from wilderness, was redefined as a tradition of violence, transmitted like inheritance through years of secrecy. Judge Harrison demanded clarification. Were these children claiming knowledge of new crimes? Rebecca answered only that the earth itself bore witness, that bones still lay undiscovered where the creek bent and where the shaft collapsed. The killings did not belong to one generation, she said. They became a practice, passed down, hidden in silence. Sheriff M. Kenzie, cautious but bound by duty, recorded the sites named by the girls. His notes, later filed in county records, confirmed subsequent expeditions to Devil's Creek and the mine shaft. Partial remains were indeed recovered. Fragments of bone, rusted buckles, scraps of fabric preserved by water and stone. None could be conclusively identified, yet their presence testified that the children's knowledge extended beyond coincidence. For Pine Hollow, the revelation was unbearable. The community could no longer be framed as a crime of the past. It was an ongoing wound, renewed by each repetition, each disappearance along the trails attributed until then to accident or wilderness. Institutional silence had preserved not only guilt, but practice. Pastor Phillips, in his journal, wrote that the congregation's faces reflected not horror of the past, but recognition of the present, that their valley was still complicit, that silence itself had become the true inheritance. He noted also the unnatural calm of the twins, who spoke not as accusers but as recorders, bearing the same detachment as court clerks transcribing testimony. Thus the history of Pine Hollow resisted closure. Its crimes were not confined to founding years, but stretched forward, woven into habit, hidden in geography. The ruling to dismantle the town did not merely erase the past. It attempted to sever a continuity of violence that, according to the twins, was still alive in the land itself. When the proceedings reached their conclusion, Pine Hollow no longer resembled a settlement, but a place waiting to be abandoned. Its homes, once clinging to the foothills with the persistence of survival, stood hollow in spirit. The judgment had stripped them of legitimacy, and the excavation had robbed them of sanctity. In this atmosphere of dispersal, the Morrison family prepared to leave. They departed quietly as they had arrived, on foot, carrying little more than the worn satchel that contained Ezekiel's Bible and the minimal possessions required for the road. The father's face, weathered by years of itinerant ministry, bore the same solemnity as when he had first stepped into the valley. Yet something in his countenance had shifted, a recognition that his children's gift, or burden, had once again unsettled a community to its foundations. The twins walked hand in hand, their steps small but deliberate. Rebecca, usually the brighter in disposition, carried herself with unusual heaviness. Rachel, ever the quieter, looked upon the church one final time, her gaze lingering on the roofline as though listening still for voices carried through the beams. When Pastor Phillips approached to take his leave, Rebecca told him that the voices had grown quieter. For now, she said, the cries of faith and hope of Whitman had faded, their story spoken aloud, their deaths no longer concealed. Phillips recorded later that the words were delivered without triumph, only exhaustion. The children had not found release in what they revealed. They had found only silence after noise, a temporary reprieve from burdens that would return elsewhere. He described them as two small vessels emptied for a time, though never truly free of the weight they carried. Ezekiel Morrison, placing a protective hand upon each of his daughters, thanked the pastor with restrained courtesy. He offered no reflection, no sermon, no explanation. To him, the revelations had become a familiar pattern, a community shaken, truths exposed, his daughters left depleted. His task, as father and minister, was to carry them onward, seeking another congregation, unaware of what would soon be uncovered in its midst. The departure was witnessed by only a few. Most residents remained within their cabins, preparing for relocation or sitting in stunned quietude. Those who watched saw the family disappear into the mist of the eastern trail, their figures absorbed by the folds of the valley. The sound of their steps faded, leaving only the creak of timbers in empty homes and the faint echo of a church stripped of its authority. Pastor Phillips stood longest, his hand resting on the open door of the sanctuary. He wrote later that their leaving marked more than the end of 3 days. It marked the passing of innocence itself, both theirs and the community's. The twins had carried away voices that would not be heard again, but they had left behind the void of recognition. Pine Hollow would die, not with fire, nor with storm, but with knowledge. And so the Morrisons left as they had come, weary, burdened, and silent. Behind them, an entire community crumbled beneath the weight of truth, and before them stretched the long road where other voices surely waited. The story of Pine Hollow concludes not in the memory of its people, who scattered into neighboring counties and left the valley to wilderness, but in the records preserved in the state archives at Frankfurt. There, among the collections of the Fayette Circuit Court, lies Judge Harrison's 47-page report, bound in cracked leather, its language precise, judicial, and unyielding. It is the most complete surviving document on the matter, though it does not pretend to explain what cannot be explained. The report catalogues the evidence as it was presented, the discovery of Marcus Webb's possessions, the confession of Elder Thompson, the unearthed remains beneath the church floor, and the corroboration of missing persons' records. It describes in detail the dismantling order, the restitution process, and the official dissolution of Pine Hollow as a legal entity. Yet, beyond this procedural framework, one finds notes of unease. Harrison admits with rare candor that the case was wholly dependent upon testimony of extraordinary and unnatural character. He acknowledges that the children's knowledge could not be reconciled with any ordinary means of inquiry, yet its accuracy compelled acceptance. Alongside the legal record rests the private journal of Pastor William Phillips, preserved by his descendants and later deposited with the archives. His entries differ in tone, weary, reflective, haunted. He describes the Morrison twins not as accusers, but as vessels, unwilling bearers of truths the living had concealed. He confesses his own sense of dread, that he had witnessed innocence transformed into something unbearable, children compelled to carry the weight of the dead. They left Pine Hollow quieter, he wrote, but never free. I believe they never will be. What became of the twins remains uncertain. No subsequent census, no marriage record, no burial ledger preserve as their names. Ezekiel Morrison appears once more in 1837, listed among itinerant preachers crossing into Tennessee, but no mention is made of his daughters. From that point, the family vanishes into the silence of history. The question of how they knew, how children not yet born at the time of the Whitmans' deaths could describe them with precision, remains unanswered. Theories have been proposed: inherited memory, second sight, divine judgment, or the darker suggestion of shared delusion. None withstand scrutiny, for the corroborating evidence lies not in speculation, but in bones, journals, and confessions. The record is exact, the explanation absent. The archives preserve these fragments without conclusion. The case file is complete in form, yet incomplete in meaning. It leaves the reader with the same silence that hung over Pine Hollow after the Morrisons' departure. The sense that innocence itself had become an instrument of remembrance, that the cries of the forgotten could inhabit the dreams of children until the truth was spoken aloud. Thus the history of Pine Hollow rests today as it did then, not resolved, not explained, but documented. And in those documents lies the enduring unease, that the dead may not rest until their stories are told, and that the most fragile among us may be chosen to carry their voices